Thank you everyone for coming to our first webinar for 2023. This is presented by AMC and sponsored by the Browning Reserve Group. Browning has been performing reserve studies since 1999. My name is Tony Brown. I'm the CEO of AMC, joined here this evening with Barbara Lemaster, who's one of our senior managers with AMC with 22 years of experience in HOA management and is CAI certified. We also have with us on our panel today a professional is Mike McDermott from the Browning Reserve Group. Mike is president of the APRA. And joining us as well, Paul Cutter from UBS Financial. He's a member of CAI and former president of the Northern California chapter. And then Chris Lucas, VP at Heritage Bank of Commerce and 25 years of experience focused in the HOA industry. We'll start this evening with Mike from Browning Reserve Group, who will be discussing the role of the reserve study for fiscal planning, how assessments fund the reserves for various projects, and the importance of knowing your reserve study and proper funding. Mike, thank you again, Browning Reserve Group, for sponsoring our webinar, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, Tony, thank you for having me here tonight. And right off the top, I'd like to applaud the attendees that are here this evening. They're spending their own time. I think it's important for the members and community leaders in particular to understand that when you understand these processes, you make our life easier. So all the board members love it when we are working with well-educated community leaders and members. So thank you for all coming and listening tonight. So as Tony mentioned, I'm with the Browning Reserve Group. We perform reserve studies. We touched 1,400 clients in the last year. I'm in my 18th year here at BRG. Previously, I was an electronical engineer by education and worked as a software engineer at Sprint, where I worked with billions of dollars a month before I came here. Before that, I was a Navy electronics technician. And being a Navy vet and serving aboard a couple of ships actually is a great way to learn about many of the systems that you find in high-rise buildings. It's part of every Navy's, every sailor's training to learn systems, not only what they work on, but other systems in the building. And many of those mimic what you'll find in a high-rise. So tonight, we're talking about financial planning. And financial planning is actually the essence of reserve studies. That's what this is about. And so this is a great topic. And we've got a great lineup, starting with the reserve study and working into what you do with the funds you have and how you save them up and make them grow. And also how you might deal with the loan that might be a possibility in the future. So in our brief time tonight, I'm not going to take a deep dive into reserves. That would take more than the total hour and a half that we have. So I want to touch on some of the basics and set the plate for the next two presenters. And so obviously, I just go through the 5 W's. And I'll start with why. Why do we do reserve studies? And the easy answer there is it's required in the Civil Code. And that's the obvious answer, but it's really not the best answer. And probably the more realistic answer there is that we are providing crucial information to members, people who live in the communities. And I'll give an example of what that really means. Imagine for a moment a young couple just buying their first condominium. They've gone out and they've got a mortgage. They're starting out, maybe a new family. And they've planned their finances probably down to the penny. Hopefully they can make it. And they move into the association understanding that they're going to have a monthly assessment of $300 or whatever it might be. And no sooner than they move in, a community manager sends a letter or knocks on the door and says, "Oh, by the way, the roof needs to be replaced. Please write a check for $10,000. And that wasn't in their view at all when they moved in. So the reserve study actually shows that these things are coming. And instead of being a big hit like that, there would have been funds collected over time so that instead of having to take that single hit just because it was an unlucky day when they moved in, money was collected ahead of time. And so the assessment was already sufficient to pay for that roof, and the new roof would have just gone on, and that new homeowner didn't have to receive that shock. And this is this is a true story, and this comes from managers who had to deliver that horrible news to owners. And so the reserve study is meant to, in part, blunt that off before we have to deliver that kind of horrible news. So obviously a reserve study is a crucial funding planning tool, and in many communities, it is the most important of the tools that you have. And obviously that's the purpose of our discussion tonight. So who performs the reserve study? And this varies somewhat, but in California, it's going to be a reserve provider such as myself or some of the others. It's a very small industry. There's only 200 or 300 credentialed providers in the whole United States. So there's a reserve provider who's going to have a reserve specialist, and they're responsible for doing the study, but they're going to work with the board of the community, and they're going to work through the community manager. So those are the people who are involved. And it's a collaboration between the reserve provider and the board so that we can meet the goals of everyone. And the professional manager has a critical role in this whole process and makes the process much easier for both of us because they deal with this all the time. They know how to deal with the board, and they know how to deal with us as a vendor. And so they actually make the process much easier. The managers in management company are also going to provide some of the important information, such as financials and some of the expense information, and they're usually up on the plans and what's coming up. So the manager's an important player. So there's really about 3 of us in the creation of a reserve study. So important to put on top of that, though, is it's the board who decides the study is final. And it is the board who, the study is ultimately the board's. This is a report that they're going to disclose to the members. So in the end, it's really the board who this study belongs to. It's not my decision to say it's final, it's the board's. And it's important that what the reserve study says as far as funding also matches what the association's budget reflects as far as reserve contribution. We'll get into that a little bit more. So when do we do reserve studies? As soon as the association, especially as soon as the association is turned over to the members, it has transitioned from the developer to the homeowner board, that's when this begins. And in California, every 3 years, we have to come out and visit the site. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And then every year we have to provide some form of an update. So every 3 years we're on site. Every year we provide some kind of an update. The first study is known as a full study. There's more involved with that study afterwards. There's a little bit less. But that's the general timing. So every year in California, we do some kind of a study. And so once we get into the year, what's the schedule like? And preferably the reserve study is substantially complete before you start your operating budget. And so remember that the reserve study is just a single line item in your operating budget. And so it is often the largest line item or one of the largest. And so the reserve study needs to be pretty well ironed out when you're getting serious about your operating budget. Hopefully everything's stable, and as we go on through the years, it's fairly well understood what we're going to anticipate as far as reserve funding and what's going to go into the budget. But we want to get this process started before the operating budget. So I would recommend that we start the reserve study at least 6 months before the beginning of the fiscal year, the new fiscal year. And this is particularly true if it's a year where we have a site visit. It takes time to set up the site visit, conduct the site visit, and then get back and produce a report. We are somewhat like CPAs when it comes to April 15th and the deadlines. Our work piles up typically in the late fall when many of our clients have basically a December 1st deadline. And so our work, we go into 24/7 in this office in the late fall. So that start early, and that also gives us time to revisit the study and make changes, make sure we got everything penciled in correctly, and gives you ample time to get your operating budget in line. And another related topic to when we do things, it's also important that communities are looking at the projects in the study, major projects that are 1 and 2 years out. This is critical because I mean, with everything that's going on in the world, and they're always going on, I'll talk about that later, it can take a couple years to get a major project completed. So you want to be looking at your study, look at what kinds of major projects are coming up in the next 1 or 2 years, get ahead of it, start talking to contractors, start getting proposals, do what you can, and make sure you're looking critically at the study to make sure those are realistic projects. Maybe you disagree with our assessment of when you should do things. So look particularly at the 1 and 2 years out. So where do we perform reserve studies? Well, it's kind of obvious. The site visits, we have to come out to the community. We'll have someone on site. There may be, on a large community, we may have a team of several analysts or specialists who are there for maybe a week. But on most communities, we'll probably have one specialist who's on site, and usually for less than a day. So that's more typical. The other part of it, of course, is in our office. For the years where we don't do the site visits, it's what I call a paper exercise. There's a lot that goes back and forth between the board, the manager, and ourselves. We completely rework the study, except for new photographs. You wouldn't know that it isn't a brand new site visit study. So every year we go through that process. The timing on that, for every hour we spend in the field, we probably spend at least 1 hour to 2 hours creating the report once we get back. So now I'll touch on what is a reserve study. And I purposely didn't start with that because I think why we do reserve studies is way important than the what. But what is a reserve study? And amazingly, when I'm on site and I'm walking around with my clipboard and my colorful vest and taking pictures, I'm often asked what I'm doing. And I respond, well, I'm working on your reserve study. And I get a blank stare. And it's like, what is a reserve study? And that's true most of the time. Members usually are not familiar with the reserve study. So what is it? The short answer, and this is the answer I give on the street, is it's a budget. It's just that it's a 30-year budget instead of a 12-month budget. So really, you know, at the simple level, it's a budget. Every reserve study should be looked at as 2 parts. And these are things that are in a budget as well. But there are the liabilities, which are, we don't call them line items, they're components. And those things are like your roof, your paving, your fences, your painting, your balconies, siding, on and on and on. Those are all things that the association's responsible to repair, replace, and maintain. Those can include things that are in exclusive use common areas, such as a balcony that might serve a single unit. It's a possibility that the community is responsible for that as well. So when I say that you should look at a reserve study as 2 parts, I really like to emphasize this as a best practice, in that if you're analyzing a reserve study, first look and take a critical look at the component inventory. See what parts are in the study and make sure you agree with the estimates that are made. You know, if we say the pool needs to be resurfaced in 3 years, do you agree with that? You may not, so we should talk about that. And once we've decided that we pretty much agree on the components, the lives and the estimates as cost and whatnot, then we need to switch gears and move over and look at the funding. And if you think about that for a second, it makes perfect sense. It doesn't work to change funding if we're still changing components. So first look at the components. I actually have one client, that's how they do it. They don't even take the full study. They only get the component portion. They go through that, they work it out, they agree with it, then we send them a funding solution. So that introduces the funding plan. And this is really what people look for in the study. And the funding plan lays out a plan that recommends reserve contributions for a full 30 years. And the goal there is to make those contributions equitable over time and to make sure you have enough funds when they're needed. There's several other aspects to it, but those are the core aspects to funding plans. And I really want to emphasize funding plans as opposed to some of the other things we might talk about later as a way of gauging where your contributions are going and how well you're doing as an association. We're going to recommend, and I can almost always guarantee, that you make increases every year. We think that's a good practice. And the way to gauge how well you're doing is how large those increases are. If the reserve contribution is growing at something near the inflation rate, let's say, or maybe slightly above, which is usually the case, you're probably in pretty good shape. Not guaranteed, of course, but if you have a funding plan that recommends 10 years of 10% increases, something's already wrong. You're behind on the contributions, or your balance is too low, or both. So really concentrate on the funding plan and the contribution increases that it represents over time. And that's part of the first part of the why we do this, is if you're looking at the community and you're trying to decide whether you want to buy or not, look at that funding plan and see if the reserve assessment, the reserve portion is growing from $200 a month to $800 a month, and that's all happening in 4 years. And that would be a red flag. So look at the funding plan, take a minute to understand it, look at the contribution increase growth. So, as I mentioned, reserve funding is possibly the largest single line item in operating budget. This is so important to understand. It's not discretionary. You can't just hold it low because you feel like it. You need to contribute what we're recommending. And if you don't, I'll discuss some of the issues that can come out, some of the fallout from that. So I kind of described what the study is, what we are. So there's a couple of things I want to say. It's kind of the converse of that, and that's what we are not. As reserve providers, we're not project managers, we're not construction managers. So we're not going, in fact, our insurance won't allow us to do that. A long time ago, that was actually something this company did, but we got away from that a long time ago. We're not code enforcement. We're not health and safety inspectors. We're not financial advisors. And that's part of the reason Paul's here tonight, because that's what he is. And some people think that that's our role. It is not. And we are not bankers. And so, of course, Chris is here to talk about the loan aspect of banking and maybe other aspects of banking as well. So those are some of the things that we are not. So how do we perform a reserve study? The first time we come on site, that's known as a full site visit, a full reserve study. We have to come out and observe everything that we can, measure it, quantify it, and assess its condition. We do that, and we take it back, and then we make estimates as to useful life, remaining life, and cost. So those are all aspects of what goes into a full reserve study. 3 years later, we come back, and we don't have to measure things again. So we just have to observe the conditions when we come back. And then every year, no matter what type of reserve study it is, we adjust costs. and we adjust remaining lives. We add whatever new information we know that the manager may have provided or the boards may have provided about work they've done or have not done. And we create a whole new funding plan. Then I bring up funding plan again. That's really what this thing's all about. And there's actually a joke in the office where some of our reports are about 1,100 pages long. And in that report, there's a single number that people want to see, and that is how much are we supposed to contribute in the upcoming year? So we quite often get asked that question. And in fact, sometimes we're asked to answer that question before we've even started. And that's equivalent to asking your tax accountant, how much am I going to receive or how much I have to pay? Don't worry about doing the return. Just tell me how much I owe. Of course, that's the last thing he knows. And the same with reserves. That's the last thing we know. The last thing that comes out is how much your contribution needs to be in the upcoming year. So that's the W's and the H. So just to give you a general feeling about how this whole thing works, if we were to ignore inflation, which we don't, but just to make the conversation simple, the reserves contribution would be flat from the day the community was built until the day the asteroid hits. They don't go up, they don't go down, they stay constant for the entire period, for the entire life of the community. So it doesn't matter if you're about to replace a roof or you just replaced the roof. If the reserves are working correctly, the contribution stays constant. Of course, we can't ignore inflation. Inflation plays a major role in reserve planning, and it is part of the model that we use. So reserves are always going up. And there's other things that influence that. Reserves do increase faster than inflation in general. There's something we call in component creep. Those were new things come into a study that weren't there originally, and there's a lot of things that happen. So inflation is a critical point, especially in the last 2 years. And if you're in a community that's been trying to catch up or was behind the gun, these last 2 years have been particularly painful. And it's one of the reasons we say always increase. And from a 30-year perspective, whenever I make this presentation, I have to say things are going to go up. It never happens that they're going to go down. Don't expect it. It's just not going to happen, not over 30 years. And so as I keep harping, annual increases are a good discipline and a best practice. Some boards, and I'm sorry if this might cross a few people, some boards wear a fake badge of honor saying that they held dues constant or they lowered them. Please give me a get out of jail card, free get out of jail card. We view that position as a badge of cowardice. You need to increase the contributions. And I'm going to talk about several things that cause pain in our life, and quite often those things are cited as a reason for pushing contributions down. But no, your duty is to the association. You have to fund reserves. It's your fiduciary duty. And every professional in this industry, whether it's an attorney, a manager, banking, insurance, they will all tell you that. So what are some of the challenges, and why are some of our other presenters here tonight? Well, if you look at reserve expenses over the long term, you'll find that they fluctuate greatly from year to year. You can have years where there's zero reserve expense, and the next year maybe millions of dollars of reserve expense. So as I mentioned before, a funding plan tries to level that all out, so you're not hitting individual owners just because they happen to live there the year that the roof gets replaced or the pavement gets reworked. However, costs always do increase, and part of the tool we have to make sure that there's funds in place when they're needed is proper savings. I'll use the term investing, but I'm going to leave those definitions to Paul. But these are very important to the long-term strength of a reserve fund. So you need to make sure that you're handling your reserve funds properly. And there are people who do that. And one of them's here tonight. One of the best is here tonight. So I want, and to emphasize this, I want you to imagine a new community that maybe their major projects, a roof replacement or a paving rebuild, those are going to be 20 years out. You may be saving millions of dollars over a couple of decades. And so careful planned savings are critical to the success of the reserves. And that's effective savings help reduce inflation's effects as well. Unfortunately, savings don't usually beat inflation, but they help mitigate. Okay, so occasionally extra funding is necessary, and it could be because our estimates were inexact. However, there are many other reasons, and it turns out some of those other reasons are more frequent and much bigger impactors than just our estimates. And I have a whole slew of them here. This came from an article that I helped write that talked about some of the problems with the idea that reserves, you only have to worry about the sun baking the roof, and so that's 20 years and nothing else changes. Well, it turns out that the components aging are actually a small factor in the overall picture. And so I'm going to kind of blast through this list, but we have pandemics, wars, disasters, economic cycles, supply chain issues, workforce issues, inflation, member delinquencies. I mean, these are, this list can go on and on. Communities are suffering. Insurance has just gone through the roof because of the fires, especially around our area. New government regulations, and to give you a few examples, several years ago, we had new pool safety equipment that had to be added. California's just implemented balcony inspections for condominiums. Lead and asbestos testing and abatement has popped up, and enforcement has grown on that. So those are some of the things that are coming in, besides just the sun beating down on the roof. And other things that creep in are conservation and efficiency things. And these are interesting because years ago we saw irrigation timers that were costing $10,000 and weather stations for the irrigation that were $50,000. And this was all done to save water. And over a couple of years, it saved operating a lot of expense on water. But it was a big hit to reserve when these things came in. And we've seen this with lighting, lighting technology. You bring in the new LED system to replace all your lighting. CFLs back in the day. So now all of a sudden lighting has become more expensive, but you're saving a ton on the operating side in electricity. So there's a shift where the money's being saved. These are all great things to do. Technology is come into this. We're seeing home automation and smart controllers and security and lighting and all types of things. And one of the biggest systems that we've seen being introduced in communities, PV solar systems, the electric solar systems. Some of these are coming in at multi-million-dollar projects. And of course, that saves community money on their electric bill, but that now becomes an expensive reserve item. So, these are things that disrupt reserve funding over the years. So kind of getting back down to where we're at, and me getting in there and being forceful about boards doing the right thing, increasing the contributions. One of the things we've seen, and we see this every few years, there's always an excuse. In the last couple of years, it's been COVID and inflation. Boards think they're doing a service to their members by artificially holding reserves low or holding the overall assessment low. And they're using these excuses. Well, we had the bubble burst, we had fires, we had all kinds of things, the building boom, the building bust. There's always an excuse, but the duty is to the association, and unfortunately not directly to the members. You have to keep the association strong. And what I mean by that is you have to have reserves that are adequately funded. How do we measure that? I kind of touched on that earlier. look at how the contribution recommendations are growing, and follow the recommendations that are in the reserve study. One of the saddest things I think I see is where we make a recommendation to increase reserve contributions, and the board says they've adopted this reserve study, which they have to do under the civil code. And then I see the budget come out later on, and I see that the budgeted reserve contribution doesn't match what the adopted reserve study said. And this is a problem for the board because you're disclosing a funding plan that you're not following. And it's kind of a lie. And actually it is a lie. You're telling the homeowners one thing and you're doing something else. And that contradiction is not a good thing. So try to avoid that. So as I mentioned, there are several things that can go in the wrong direction, and that's just life in general. So if you find yourself considering a loan, it turns out that a loan can possibly be the right choice. And especially looking back, and actually I had this as my own personal circumstance. I needed to do some home repairs in my home. And if I had taken a loan out 2 years ago before this inflation that just occurred, I would have saved myself a lot of money at this point. So a loan can actually be a hedge against inflation if you know how to play the timing of it. So a loan is one of the solutions if you find yourself in trouble, and this does happen, things fail early or whatnot. And also special assessments. These are dirty words, I realize that. We try to avoid them, but they are realities, and many communities find themselves in that position. So if you find yourself in need of a loan, there's experts like Chris who work you through that process. But I would like to ask, as a reserve provider, that you work with us as well. Let us model the special assessment. Let us model the loan into the reserve funding plan. Surprisingly, I had a large client who special assessed their owners, and they didn't talk to us. We didn't know about it until the next year. And I looked at it and I said, there was no reason for that special assessment. It was a misunderstanding somewhere. They didn't need to do it. Most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time when these things come up, you need to do it. But there's a mixture. It might be a loan and a special assessment. It might be an increase in regular reserve contributions. It could be all of the above. If you suddenly find yourself needing to spend $1 million that you didn't anticipate, it doesn't mean you have to get $1 million loan. Maybe you need half of it, and half of it comes from reserves. So work with us and go out and get the loan. And with that, I am going to move it along to Paul, who's going to tell you how to take all these funds that we've saved up so diligently and make them work for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. If anybody has any questions for Mike, we'll be holding a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and you can always drop your questions into the quick Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom panel. We'll turn it over now to Paul Cutter. Paul Cutter from UBS will discuss strategy and policy tools and ongoing process. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And thank you for the lead in, Michael. That actually it would make my job so much easier if you preceded me at every meeting I held. So thank you. Strategy and policy is regarding the investments and the savings that you have made that has been directed by the reserve study, the quantity, how much to make sure that you have enough as you go through a cycle of saving and spending. And so once you have the money set aside, the question arises as to what to do with it. And here's where I come in and my small niche in this overall process. The goal of the savings and the investments of funds is always very straightforward. Many of you have heard this multiple times, and that is number one goal is the safety of the funds themselves. And by that, we mean you don't want to have a board meeting where you have to explain where the money went. It's not a good meeting. Second is liquidity. The only reason this money is set aside in the first place is to be spent. And it's going to be spent at particular times for particular things. And then finally, the last question is return. And here you're looking at a return that in terms of interest, that is hopefully matching or exceeding inflation. The historical data over many decades, like 8, 9, 10 decades, is that short-term investments match inflation and that longer-term investments may exceed it slightly. Oh, but there's something else involved there too, and you don't get to keep everything you earn. And so the state of California and Washington, D.C. appreciates very much that you've earned this return on your money. But in most cases, in one way or another, they're going to claim their part of it. There can be exceptions to this for various accounting and CPA type reasons, but for the most part, earnings that are unrelated to the business of the association, you do get to pay and support your local and federal governments. One of the things that I exhort boards to do that have savings and are looking at doing anything with them, whether it be hold it in a bank deposit, look at something like treasuries or something fancier, have it written down what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, why you're going to do it. And this is very simply an investment policy statement or IPS. There are samples out there. CAI has gap reports on it. Other organizations have reports on, not specifically for investment policy statements, but for how to handle the reserves in general or the duties of a treasurer perhaps, and it will include samples in there. And I would heartily encourage putting it down, unless you are a board member who wishes to be a lifetime board member and maintain that institutional knowledge for yourself forever. It's a rare person. No, I've never heard of that person. So put it in writing. It's good for the organization. It makes sense. It lives with the organization, not with the individuals then. Mike has led into this made it so easy, because where he pointed out that when a reserve study is prepared, the one thing that board members, committee members, and members are going to look at first is the how much do I have to pay. Whereas when I look at a reserve study, that 1 out of 1,100 pages that I'm going to look for is not how much, it's going to be that funding page. Which is a forecast for the next 30 years, perhaps, of how much is coming in, going out, when that is occurring, et cetera, because that's really a roadmap to the association's physical plant's liabilities, when things are going to crumble rather than be built, and when they're going to wear out, when they're just going to be time to replace them or upgrade them or keep them repaired. And that's when you need your money also. So I would love to say that what I do is extremely complicated and difficult and can only be done by a very large computer program that I've created. And that is not the case. It's very simply matching up the money that you have saved to the liabilities that your association has. Doing so allows, indeed almost forces you to extend your average maturity of investments beyond cash. It is very typical for me to see a board's balance sheet when I first meet with them before creating any ideas or proposals, that their perception of a long-term investment might be a 1-year CD. And that might be appropriate for some situations if your expenditures are 1 year out. But Typically, they're going to be 1, 3, 5, 10, 20 years out and laddered out there. So my goal is to nudge a board's and an association's finances out to maybe an average of a 2, 3, 4 year average maturity, which means they have something coming due every year, maybe for 5 or 6 years. Thereby having some funds at different times and different rates all the time. This is a strategy that seeks to track the middle ground of what interest rates are doing over an economic cycle. It takes out all of those questions that I get at the initial meeting of, well, what about the Federal Reserve and what they're doing? And what about bond interest rates? Oh yeah, and what about inflation? We don't know what it's going to be 6 months from now, let alone 6 years or 30 years from now. This smooths out the highs and the lows. It does not mastermind that you buy investments when the interest rates are absolutely high and you sell them when the interest rates are low, because we just don't know. The other thing it does is it allows that those funding mechanisms where you're putting money in every month, every year, will be coming in at different times and at different interest rates. So with recent experience where interest rates for 2, 3 years were under 1, and if those with a longer memory, perhaps 12, 15 years ago, it was very similar. You were struggling to get a 1% would have been a great return. For those associations that have been saving and investing for a long time, they already had investments that had previously locked in 2, 3, 4, 5, 7% rates coming due at different times. And that felt very good at the time. You'd be shocked at how many of those same clients felt that a 5% rate of return at the time they made the investment was horrible because rates were going to go up to 8. They may have not, we don't know. But the fact is, they were really happy that they had those 5% CDs or treasury bonds when rates were 1%. The difficult part of this strategy comes, for example, in the last 2 years, where you're making investments at 1% or less, or biding your time in money markets for at very low rates. But that is part of the process. You will average a higher rate of return over time with this strategy. You will never have your investments all at the highest rate. I'm sorry. Likewise, you will never have them all at the lowest rate. You're going to track that middle ground again. So you've got cash flow coming in. The cash flow comes in 3 major forms. One is the contributions that you're making periodically. One is, if you've been doing this for a number of years, you're going to have securities maturing every year also. And then finally, a smaller component is the interest earnings on the assets you've set aside previously. So you've got these 3 elements of positive cash flow that you're trying to match up with the quote negative cash flow, or the payments, the expenses that are forecasted in the reserve study. The funding study does a really neat job on that one page for 1 year. It'll show how much you're starting with, how much you're putting in, how much you're spending, and how much you end up with. So it becomes pretty simple. Make sure you have enough cash flow, that is contributions, earnings, and maturing, to cover those expenditures. A simple example would be if you're replacing some major component, such as a roof or fencing, in 5 years, and that's the only thing you're saving money for, then today you would be buying a 5-year security to pay for that. Next year, you'd be buying a 4-year security, and the following year, a 3-year security, so that by the time you get to year 5, you've got enough money saved up to pay for it. You've done it. This comes back to where Mike was touching on perhaps the equity of who pays for what. And I can make an argument that it really doesn't matter, because ultimately it's reflected in the value of the property. You can save, it's a pay now, pay later sort of thing. You can save now, and that's the least expensive way to do it, because you're earning interest on what you've got. You can assess as you go, which is, I actually know some associations that are very small, composed of very wealthy individuals, and they just don't want to do the monthly savings. They just tell the manager, tell me how much I have to write a check for. It's nice. And then there's the others where they make a choice, or they end up in a circumstance, whether by acceleration of the liabilities in terms of time and need, or having not saved enough earlier, where they choose to borrow money and future owners will be paying that off. It's not inequitable in any sense, any one of these three, to current owners, because it's all reflected in the value of your home. As an aside, what I always tell homeowners to do, if they are a client of mine, they have money in the bank, and if you have 100 units, 100 homes, and $100,000, every home, they should be selling, when they're selling that home, they should be saying, oh, and it comes with $1,000 in the bank. And sometimes that number is very large, and people forget about that. It is an asset. It can work the other way against you as well. So, but it is something to look at as you go. So there's two elements of the funding plan that Michael touched on as well that are variables beyond the physical plant. And these are, when you start forecasting, you have to make some assumptions. And two of the assumptions that Mike deals with, I deal with, I'm sure Chris does as well, at least in terms of comments from boards, is what is the interest rate forecast for 30 years and what is the inflation rate forecast? And I have seen boards over the last 2 years put in inflation numbers of 5 and 6 and 7% with other reserve companies, or doing their own reserve analysis for 30-year extrapolation, and they're only earning 1%, because remember, that's what rates were a year ago. Well, you're going to be ending up having to save a lot of money to keep up in that, because when you start going out 30 years compounding at 7%, that $1,000 item becomes a very large number. I don't know how much, very large, and you're not saving any money along the way. So here's where companies, reserve companies and preparers such as Browning Reserve Group, they have the experience, the knowledge, the data to show that on average over a 30-year period, what rates may be, and whether it be for inflation or interest rates. And honestly, a lot of times it's less important to have the absolute numbers absolutely right. It's more important to have the relative numbers. So if you have 7% inflation and 1% interest, something is askew there, because there's never been a long period of time, probably not longer than a year, where anything like that has ever existed in the US economy thus far. And I'd like to say thus far, and I hope that that remains that way. Likewise, if you assume 5% rates of return and 2% inflation, that doesn't last very long either. So typically they're going to be very close to one another, and you can shade it one way or the other within 0.5 or 1% over time. Beyond that, it just doesn't matter. Just don't be extreme in either of the presumptions. What we do at UBS is we collect this funding plan, we match it up to your financials. The key elements of your financials are your balance sheet, where we see what you have, particularly for reserves. And then on the income statement, very specifically, how much you're saving for reserves. I like to see it on an income statement, because it's not uncommon, and I'm betting Mike sees this frequently enough, as well as Chris, when looking at reserve studies, that there's a disconnect between what was recommended in the reserve study and what is actually going in. Or maybe it's just a failure to update it from last year. Run into that oftentimes as well. So I like to see what's actually being done and talk to the board about what their plan is in this regard. The next step is then working on preparing an actual proposal, which is taking all of these variables and data points and putting them together and creating a ladder of maturities. And when I say a ladder, it's a customized ladder. It's not a very simple ladder of 100,000 every year for 3 years sort of thing. It's going to look at, well, next year you have very little expenditures, but in 2025 you have big expenditures, and then your next big expenditures are in 27. And so we'll target those years. I call it a target laddering, if you will. And it matches up so that you make sure you have the money when you need it. It's not uncommon that I'm dealing with associations where 50 to 60% of their reserves are really going for one major expense. And that expense may be as far out as 10, 15, 20 years. I rarely recommend those very long-term investments, but there are times when it makes sense to put a small portion even in those very long investments, and they can be advantageous. And it's intriguing to see, I've been doing this a long time, longer than roofs last, and longer than repaving lasts. And so I see those longer term investments being made and spent. And the boards, 15, 20 years down the road who had nothing to do with the initial investment are so happy that the money is there. It's a good thing. It's not an all or nothing thing. You ladder these things over time to make sure they make sense. The types of tools and investments that we look at credit quality, number one. Money market accounts are a key element because this is where you hold your liquidity. That is the funds that may be spent in the very near future. Banks and brokerages such as I work at, and banks such as where Chris works at, we have a multitude of cash products that can offer interest rates as you're holding these funds. Bank deposits are FDIC insured. There are money market funds, which are not FDIC insured, but may be composed of treasury bonds or government bonds, and that might be of comfort to some associations. And typically you're going to get a better rate with those than you might on deposits, although for 2 years, bank deposits earned a lot more than money market funds. So it ebbs and flows over time and comes in as to which one might be better at any moment. But cash management is really a management for liquidity, for that which is coming up in the near future, or that which for a calamitous or unexpected need that you keep in cash for immediate access. Different boards will be comfortable with different levels of cash for that. The average of hundreds of associations that I deal with is around 17% of their reserves are in cash. That ranges from 100% because they have a huge unknown looming in front of them, perhaps litigation, something like that, to 2 or 3% for those associations that have been around longer, have gone through this process multiple times, and have a high comfort level with their cash flow predictions. But it averages out to about $1 out of $6 or $7 is set aside in cash. Beyond that, we're looking at CDs or certificates of deposit. These are issued by banks. They are FDIC insured, up to $250,000 per issuer. So you can have a portfolio of CDs. They're offered both by broker. There are brokered CDs, which I offer. There are various banking products available, for example, through Heritage Bank, with allowing you to have more than the $250,000 with the one bank, and maintaining the credit quality that you need for that. You may get more options with somebody like me in that we go beyond just bank certificates of deposit. We utilize U.S. Treasury securities. These are bonds of various sorts. The Treasury has about 9 different types of issues. The types I deal with are very simple Treasury bills, which are short-term, Treasury bonds, which can be out as long as 30 years. There are TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protection Securities, which are one of the better investments for an association. Remember that those 2 assumptions made at the reserve study for interest rate and rate of inflation. A TIPS, or Treasury Inflation Protection Security, guarantees, once you buy it, that you're going to earn right now about 1 to 1.5% over inflation for as long as you own it. Interesting. You've just locked in a rate of return over inflation. You've solved one of the problems. It's not a solution for the entire portfolio, but it can be a piece of it that might make sense for your portfolio, something to investigate. There are also zero coupon bonds that work like savings bonds. You pay pennies for what will be worth exactly $1. I particularly like these for those long-term needs because they effectively are automatically reinvesting and growing in value. So what's 50 cents today may be $1, 10 or 15 years down the road, and it may even have some tax advantages as well. And then finally, there's those tax advantages may be realized both in treasuries and government agency bonds where they're not taxed by the state of California, though they are by the federal government, or municipal bonds that have various tax characteristics ranging from fully tax exempt to fully taxable, but may be advantageous for an association as well. One of the things I'd really like to emphasize is that this is an ongoing process. We need to see those updated funding studies that come from your updated reserve study. Let us see them. Let us know if there's a significant change. We'll usually pick it out pretty quickly. If you want help or some discussion regarding what interest rates and inflation numbers might want to be from a perspective different than a reserve study preparer, happy to do that as well. The one thing I'll emphasize is that it is extremely valuable, and this is something that where professionals like Chris or I come in, because honestly, there are times where we're kind of cracking the whip, and it may not be on a current board, but it's over the lifespan of a relationship. Many years, we're dealing with many different individuals and boards where we are enforcing some consistency and persistency to a strategy of matching up with your liabilities, of reinvesting funds when you need to, of making sure that not too much accumulates in cash and that you put it out there into an investment and all. So it's consistent and persistent execution of the strategy that you laid out at the very beginning. And that will pay off in the long run. So I've talked about those associations that have the money, have saved the money, and can do something with it. Remember, I said that there are other methods as well, and that's the immediate assessment or paying later, which is the borrowing of funds. And that's where Chris has particular expertise and offers things that are beyond what I can do. And I'll turn it over to Tony to introduce Chris at this point.
All right, thank you, Paul, for that. Appreciate it. Again, if you do have any questions for Paul, we will be holding the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please add your questions to the Zoom Q&A portion at the bottom of the Zoom function. We already have 2 questions that have already been posed specifically for Mike. So please add your questions there. Now we'll move on to Chris from Heritage Bank. She will discuss HOA loans and navigating through the loan process.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tony, and to the other speakers. It's a real honor to be speaking with them on this panel. A couple takeaways. I just thought I'd share with everybody a little recap to get us going and hang in this last half hour or so. I love what Mike said about using the reserve study as a funding planning tool and to start early to review all those components that come up in those 30 years, maybe take a look at the 10 years and look for those large components that come up, because that kind of plays into loans. Looking to the future, and my favorite, which he had me at this line, we can model loans in the reserve study, which is fantastic. That to have a reserve study analyst come in and project what does it look like to have a special assessment in their loan in the reserve study itself, and then take a look at it over those years is absolutely fantastic. So thank you, Mike, for that. And Paul, what can I say? You are always a joy. I love your wit. And for all of you attendees out there, make no mistake about it, you get the best with him because he really does do that long-term analysis. And I'm sure he's got all the tools of the trade to map those out and make those great graphs, as we do not have, in showing how your interest income can grow and to meet all those needs. So that was really, really good, what you had covered. So if everybody can see this, I'm going to just expand my PowerPoint so it kind of fills the screen. And I first want to start off that to all the attendees. If you're in that situation where you're doing everything right, you've invested your reserves and you have some income, but it's just not enough, and you come to a point where you have these components that need to be replaced, you get some proposals and scope of work and what it's going to cost, and you realize, oh my gosh, we do not have the funds to do this. And this is the time where we come in. First of all, I want to say it's not your fault. And I'll say it again, it is not your fault. That's my Goodwill Hunting line for you as you're kind of crying and pulling your hair out. What do we do? And hopefully the HOA bankers that provide loans, we are the solution for you. So I'm just going to see if this works. So the beginning of this fills up my whole screen. Let's see. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. So I have an agenda. And when I do this, I can't see the other screen. So Tony, if you can jump in and say, yes, it's okay. You can.
Yeah, so I believe you need to, at the very bottom, click share screen, and then another box will pop up, which will ask which screen, which window.
Which one? Sorry about that. Okay,
Yeah.
yes, because I have two screens here. Thank you. Let me share screen options.
Yeah.
Oh, it says one participant share screen. I'm doing both. Let's see. Oops. Okay.
Yeah, so you don't want to press the arrow, you just want to press the big green box.
Okay.
And then a secondary box will pop up.
Yeah, and I couldn't see. I know what you mean on the green.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. And let me just bring that up. Okay, can everybody see that, or do I need to move my screen?
We don't have anything being shared yet.
Okay. Because it's
There you
on
go.
two. Does that work?
There we go.
Oh, good. Thank you. Okay. Technology. I can get some help on that. Wonderful. So let's see then if I can go to, there we go. Okay. So did a little agenda of reviewing with you the typical loan project timeline on this. And again, one of the things that came up in the presentation is start early. And boy, when it comes to loans, you should start early. Most of the boards that come to me to take a look and see if they can qualify for a loan are talking to me in September, October, November, and the project is going to happen in the following year. So these are the little items that I'll be covering here, what to do, what to prepare ahead of time before you apply, how do you communicate with the members, and actually go into the loan qualification, what we're looking for in order to qualify for a loan. So this is just sort of a general mapping of what it actually takes and what you need to do to prepare. So as Mike said, that sometimes it takes 5 months to really do a really good review of the reserve study and get an analyst out there to actually do it and prepare it. And so we kind of take that into consideration because we like to see an updated reserve study, even though you might be in year 2 of a 3-year required reserve study. It's nice to have those financial numbers updated so we can really see currently what has been updated to date, or what have you spent to date on that reserve study. So you can see, it takes 6 to 8 weeks. Then you may be going now, then you find out, that you have this big project coming up, whether it be roofing and maybe there's siding, and maybe you even want to bundle a few of those components together into one project if it makes sense, because a lot of times if you're doing roofing and some siding, you're going to want to do the painting, even though the painting may not be coming up until another 3 or 4 years. So bundling sometimes of those large components that come up within a 5-year period is something to take a look at. So projects, you get your specs and bids, you realize you want to get a loan, and this ballot prep is only comes into play if you need to have a special assessment to do the loan. That it gets a little complicated because most board members, they think that either they're just going to use their reserve funds to pay for the loan. But when we do these cash flow analysis, we might tell you, well, you still have to do a special assessment. And so then you might consider, well, what's the purpose of the loan then? Well, the purpose of the loan, when there's still a special assessment to pay for this project, is that you can have the funds now to get everything scheduled in, to get the work done today, instead of forcing everybody to come up with a special assessment all at once. Sometimes that does happen, but most members really do have a hardship of that, and they can pay over time. And so the loan is sort of bridges that gap, so you can schedule your contractors and have the loan in place. The contractors love that because they know you have financing ready to go. And then the homeowners like it because they can be able to pay that special assessment over time, which will be used to pay for the loan. So again, the credit underwriting takes 2 to 3 weeks. Literally, it could take a week. But what we tend to do is we have to wait for an opinion letter from your attorney to say, yes, the ballot has passed if there's a special assessment requirement. And contracts, they don't get signed off on until the board knows that a loan is in place. So that kind of is hovering there. You may have the specs and the proposals, but most board members, if they know they're going to need a loan to be able to do this project, they're not going to sign on that contract until they know the loan has been approved. So you could see it's definitely a number of months. And I would say that the average is anywhere from 3 to 5 months. And it depends on when the boards come to us. Sometimes they come to us when they have all of this done and they need the loan like yesterday, but they've done all this already. And sometimes they come to us and it's at the very beginning, which we kind of like too, because it helps us to plan for with them. So what do you do, and especially in handling this, because we want to make sure that you are successful in qualifying for a loan. And when I say you, I mean the association. So one of the first things we do is we're reviewing your finances. We want to see that the association is in pretty good shape, other than, not having enough funds for this particular project. When I say get your financial house in order, it really is this review delinquencies. We have a requirement of not having any more than 5% of your owners be delinquent that is 60 days and over. Why, you might ask, is because if there's problems with delinquencies of regular assessments, there could be problems in paying a special assessment. Or if you're just paying the loan out of your reserves and you're having higher delinquencies and your reserve allocation is lowered, then that could be a problem in paying the loan back. So getting the financial house in order is making sure you don't have these huge outstanding, account or aging reports where it shows owners that are in collections possibly and owe thousands of dollars. We like to have a little more information about that, make sure there's a plan, that they are on a payment plan, that maybe it's old money and you can write off as bad debt on your financials, just to have a good plan in there. And if you do have higher than 5%, we like to see at least 3 months consecutively just at 5 and under. So that's kind of getting the financial house in order, is cleaning up those delinquencies and making sure that if you do have some large delinquent owners, that they are in some kind of collection and or payment plan, or if maybe you have information that they're selling and the association will get paid back in escrow. Obviously, the reserve study, you heard about it. That's really important. We want to make sure, again, that the financial part of it is updated so that we're really seeing, good up-to-date information. We want to know what you spent in the beginning of the year already, which you wouldn't see on the reserve study. You would see it when it gets updated, but we want to make sure that we know what is going to be covered by this loan on the reserve study, what's been paid already, so we don't double count it. And it comes into play later, as I'll review. The governing documents, the one thing that I will say, and that this has happened, is if you have old governing documents that dictate that in order for an association to enter into a loan agreement, you have to have 2/3 of a vote. And it has happened. And that is almost impossible when, you have, 66 to 70 or 3/4 or 75% of a vote in order to enter a loan agreement. So check your governing documents to make sure you don't have those wonky statements like that, because that could be, a real issue if you have to go out for a vote just on that one. If you do have to do that, and there's a special assessment, your good attorney will make sure that's in the ballot. And so you cover, take care of 2 birds with 1 stone kind of scenario. And as you say, Dan, this is my little takeaway. It's really important to engage with your legal counsel early in the process. If you think you're going to have a special assessment and work on the ballot, and to again review the governing documents to make sure there's no issues in entering into a loan agreement. So this is just about, Mike has already covered it. I'm just going to move forward. So these are the things that we kind of take a look at, because in our cash flow analysis on the reserve study, if you tell us, okay, we're going to do the roofing and painting, well, we're going to take all your income and then deduct your expenses and then add in what your reserve balances are currently to see if whatever that number is, it's going to offset a loan payment plus any other reserve component that comes up during the life of the loan that you have to cover. That's basically it. That's going to help us to say whether you're going to either be negative or you're going to have enough funds to cover a loan payment, as well as the other items that come up on your reserve study that are scheduled to be replaced. And the time frame that we're looking at is anywhere from 1 to 10 years, which is kind of the average loan terms are 10 years. So what often happens, and this is where when Mike said, to use your reserve study analyst to model what a loan would look like in there is fantastic, because so often when we get these loan requests, we don't get the information of what all the items are, so we can deduct it off of the reserve study that's going to be covered by the loan. So we don't want to double count, all those expenses on there, so we can get a true picture of what your net position will be. Again, we want to make sure that you can cover a loan payment while also taking care of those other reserve components that come up during the life of the loan that are scheduled to be replaced. So, again, the prep is everything. You should have prepared to, have architectural services if you need that, to discuss with the construction management services. For loans that are $1 million and more, we require that the association does have a construction manager overseeing it. And it's important because you're dealing with especially with the higher dollar amounts of $1 million plus, that's a lot of money. And you want somebody to be budgeting that and overseeing the scope of work and the expenditures as the work is being done. So we require it, and then we map or mirror the same budget that the construction manager will do. And so when we release the funds, we're going to make sure that the funds released are being paid for work that's been done, and we're literally going to be checking off that bucket on a budget. And that's good for the association because you've got two eyes kind of overseeing that project. So again, the project analysis, just you have the reserve study that kind of goes back to where we started over there. What it takes for a bid process, and the bids, you have to all those meetings, figure out which vendor you're going to choose. And usually right around here is when we do get a loan application, because you have pretty good numbers of what you are facing with for the project. And from your reserve study what you have in reserves to pay for it. And often we will have a combination, of combination of reserves being applied to the project as well as the a special assessment. So when we get a loan application, we basically give you a proposal letter after we get a couple of things, and it's all the financial information, very simply 4 items. And with that, we kind of know if we're going to do the loan. Unless you surprise us with something else, literally we will know. And so what we provide you is a proposal or expression of interest letter. We will outline the terms and conditions of the loan. We'll tell you what the current rate will be, although it's not locked in until we get all the rest of the information. Most of the loan rates are fixed because it makes it really easy for the management company to map that out and what everybody might owe or what the reserve allocation should be. So fixed rates are easier to deal with. At that time, usually the ballot is also sent out, because sometimes, again, the members need to vote on entering into a loan agreement for the association, as well as approve a special assessment if it is needed. We talked about the cost of loans, the cost of loans and what the project scope of work includes. And often associations don't include all those ancillary costs. And, that's always a good thing to at least consider, because you have a construction manager, that's additional funds. And I've seen some construction project managers charge up to $100,000, but it was on a $7 million loan, but it can be really high. Typically it could be, I don't know, $15,000 to $70,000. It's a lot of money other than just the actual work. You also have the attorneys that have to spend time in reviewing your documents and reviewing all the contracts, proposals that are given to you to make sure that they're protecting the association. And one thing we require from your legal counsel is an opinion letter to confirm that, again, the association can enter into a loan agreement per their governing documents, as well as be able to, if they have a special assessment that they needed to pass, that it was passed in accordance to the documents. So there's that cost. So what a lot of associations do is take those ancillary costs and add it to the actual project. So you might want to do that because it's usually more. And management companies have to charge more because if there is a special assessment, they have to administer that special assessment and collection of those. And so they usually have a cost to that. And then, of course, there's all these others down here. There's so much more to consider. And so that's helpful if you're thinking of the what are we going to borrow, to take into consideration all those ancillary costs. And once you get all of that, the other part of it is really, really important, is to communicate with the members. I can't tell you how often that I've come across in the many years that I've been working with associations on loans, that the ones that are very, very successful and they pass a special assessment without any problems is because they really had strong communication with the memberships. They had town hall meetings. They had all the service providers come and attend the meeting to tell you what is happening. Why do we need to do this project? What failed? Why don't we have enough money? and then the solutions, how we can do this through association loan. When you disseminate really good information to the memberships, then they can get behind it and pass that special assessment. So communication is absolutely imperative. And of course, we can, when I attend these meetings, I talk about the advantages of borrowing the loan now. And again, it's to bridge that gap. You're being able to secure your contractors, get on their schedule. And believe me, they are swamped right now because of the SB 326 repairs of your wood structure balconies and other wood structure components. So you want to come with, to them to get on their schedule. And as I said before, they're very happy when they know you've got the financing in place to be able to do it. Our qualifications, so size of HOA, we do have a minimum of 25 units. And the reason why is because going lower than that, although I've done loans for 20, 22, so just have to kind of depends. And the reason why is that when you have a much smaller association, if one person defaults on the regular assessment or special assessment, that could have an impact on paying back the loan. So we have the minimum of that. We require the reserve study is really, really critical in our cash flow analysis and determining whether we could do the loan. I already brushed on delinquencies. The financials, we want to make sure that the association has consistent financials. There's nothing that's very bizarre out there. And we love that they have management, really important to have professional management, although we have done loans for self-managed, mostly large scale communities and have staff. We like the HOA stability. And on that, on the stability, we really mean on the owner occupancy ratio. There's always that rule of thumb of if you have more people that are owner occupied, there's more pride of ownership and less other issues when you have high rentals. So, and I think that is it.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. And thank you for all of you that are sharing your knowledge and expertise this evening. And again, thank you again to Browning Reserve Group for their sponsorship of tonight's webinar. We do have some questions that have been posed by attendees of the webinar, and I'll start with two that are specific for you, Mike, in terms of the reserves. First question is if the HOA is underfunded, what is the responsibility of the board?
Great questions, and there's two parts of that. We would have to define what it means to be underfunded. I think we all know what it feels like, but there's not a great definition for that. So I could go into some of the definitions we use. So often this discussion goes off into percent funded, which is the next question up. But let's say that, yes, indeed, we found ourselves at the point where we don't have sufficient funds to replace the roof, and the roofs are leaking. And so obviously we're going to need to do something like get a loan, special assess, raise the regular assessment. All those things are possible. So what is the board's responsibility? Their responsibility is to the association. They have to fix the roofs. They can't defer that. So it's not really a question. If the work needs to be done, it has to get done. It's going to be painful for owners in many cases, but the board's responsibility is to get the work done. Deferring a leaking roof is it just causes damage, and costs go up, and you end up with insurance and lawsuits and all kinds of things going the wrong direction. So if that addresses that question. When I read it, I wasn't sure if you were asking if the board was responsible for being underfunded, and I would stay away from that particular version of this question.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just everything may have worked against everyone.
Right. And that kind of dovetails, as you already were alluding to, what is the reasonable percentage for the reserves to be funded?
Okay, so there's a few people here that have heard me before. When we start talking about percent funded, it's a problematic metric. I do about a 1-hour presentation. I bring out about 20 points about the problems with percent funded. So is there a reasonable percentage? There is not a number. Even if I believe percent funded worked, there's not a number. In general, I can say there's some certain directions, but I'm not a big proponent. I'm not a proponent of percent funded at all. But I'll give you the general direction. If you have an association that's amenity rich, so this is probably going to be a large association with lots of clubhouses, a golf course, a lake, just everything you can imagine. They own their own roads, they're gated, they're responsible for maybe all the maintenance on all the buildings. And it turns out that their reserve expenditures over time, because of this richness of amenities and things they have to replace, their expenses are actually somewhat flat. They're always spending a lot of money every year. In that case, percent funded could actually be very low. And to give you an absolute example, if you started with $0, you're 0% funded. If you collected $2 million, spent $2 million, you'd end up with $0, be 100% funded. And if it was always $2 million every year, that would work forever. The opposite of that is the small community that has, like as Paul mentioned, what I call a dominant component, which is often asphalt in a small street and gate type component or community. If basically all they're saving for is to resurface the asphalt every 20 or 30 years, they probably need to be 100% funded. And if you listen to my whole presentation on percent funded, you may find that you need to be more than 100% funded. It turns out that being 100% funded is like balancing a pencil on the tip. It gets you to exactly where you need to be, but it doesn't give you a buffer if the cost goes over a little bit. So not a big fan of percent funded. We're not going to go there tonight. So in a large community, many of them will work at 30 to 40% funded. Smaller ones, that number would be higher. And a lot of it has to do with timing and just a lot of different things.
Great, thank you, Mike. Next question we have for you, Paul. How does a board find the best investment opportunities?
Probably the easiest place to start is by asking their manager for who knows the answer to that. So, and sometimes the manager may defer immediately to the accounting department, the management of the accounting department, who has experience perhaps with far more associations that do have money and what they may be doing with it, and maybe able to offer some guidance or references, at least in that regard. And of course, you are dealing with a banker, so talk to your banker. And if you're not getting anything from those three, something's very wrong, but you could ultimately go to your CPA or something like that and see what they have to say. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that's good information there. And then the last question we have is related to reserve studies being provided to the homeowners and the necessity for reserve studies to be done on site every 3 years.
The civil code requires that there are certain financial disclosures that are made to members every year. There's a list of there's an index of about, I think it's around a dozen items, and 3 of those items come from the reserve study. Unfortunately, they are very compacted, very you don't see enough to get a good feeling of the reserve study. So yes, members are supposed to get that financial package every year. You're supposed to get it at least 30 days before the beginning of the new fiscal year. And that includes the funding plan in the reserve study, the thing that I talked about. And every member has the right to see the reserve study. You can always ask for that. So yes, and yes, you do have a right to see the whole study. Do we do site visits every 3 years? If we get hired, which most of our clients do hire us, we're back every 3 years. That's a requirement in the civil code. Thank you.
Okay.
So Tony, one of the attendees, or did he leave? I was gonna, Bill, Mr. Bill Rohrs had his hand up for quite some time.
Okay.
Looks like maybe he left. Okay, his hand's gone. Okay. And then Al Lammers, one of the board presidents, sent an email prior to the webinar, and he had a question about investments. He wanted to know does it make sense for an extremely small HOA to consider an investment portfolio? And should a HOA consider money market investments or any other small investments?
I'll take a stab at that. The too small question is no, because it's on a percentage basis. If you can improve the rate that you're earning on whatever balance you have, that is an improvement. The difficulty lies in whatever costs may be involved, whether it be account fees or transaction costs, are spread over such a smaller base that they may have some greater impact on the net return after expenses. So that
Lost again.
that's something to be careful of.
Looks like we're losing Paul's feed there a little bit. There was a question also posed in terms of Browning's fees for reserve studies. We also have a question about investment manager fees, but Paul, connection looks to have been lost.
Yeah.
Right. So the reserve study fees, of course, go with the amount of time that we spend. So presently, a site visit type study is going to be at least $1,200, and that goes up very, very large communities. And we also do studies for other types of entities like park districts and whatnot. That fee can go up into many tens of thousands of dollars. And that's for the site visit years. The updates without site visit, our fees are generally around $300. And for the largest communities, they go up to around $1,000. So that's pretty much our fee structure.
Okay. And Paul, we have you back now. There was a question in terms of your fee structure for investment.
UBS and I get paid when there's a transaction, a purchase of an investment. When I get this question from current clients or clients who've been with me for years and years, and I do a retrospective of what that actually amounts to, it ranges from about 0.20 to 0.30% per year. On the high end, if you're in an accumulation phase where you have more investments, on the low end of that, if you're disaccumulating, i.e. you're spending your money, then you're not reinvesting, then we're not making as much money.
Okay. Excellent. Well, again, thank you all, Paul, Mike, Chris, for being here this evening and presenting your expertise and knowledge in your respective fields. And again, thank you to Browning Reserve Group for sponsoring our webinar this evening. We appreciate all the attendees for coming. We will have additional items from this webinar on our YouTube channel for AMC, and some of those will be on our website as well. And you can always get in contact with us, your hosts, if you have any further questions or would like to get the contact information for any of these professionals here this evening.
Thank you.
Tony.
Thank
All right.
you all. It was good to see you all. Another question? Oh, it was just a thank you to you, Tony, and the panelists from Crystal at Almaden Place.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
All right, everybody.
Bye.
See you at our next one. Take care.
Good
Thank
night.
you.